at an international, national, and local level, what's being done in response to mass violence and atrocities around the world, and also actions to help prevent such atrocities. So I'm going to actually just start right here with Jai. Is that okay with you? Perfect. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and give her remarks.
Good morning, everyone. So as Kelsey said, my name is Jai-Ayla. I'm the program officer for the Stanley Foundation's Mass Violence and Atrocities team. We are a team of two, so Kelsey and I work together quite closely on everything that we do. And the Stanley Foundation actually has a longer history with the South Dakota World Affairs Council than I even imagined, or than I realized when Bob first reached out to me. But we're a small operating foundation that is based in Muscatine, Iowa, of all places. And it was founded by Max Stanley, who actually made his money and his career as an engineer. And the Stanley consulting firm operated all across the globe, and I think it really inspired him and gave him kind of a different worldview and global perspective on some of the major issues of the time. And really, he adopted quite a globalistic perspective on how to achieve peace and security around the world. So he started the Stanley Foundation in we're 62 years old, so somebody can do the math for me. But it's been operating from Muscatine, Iowa ever since. And so not only does the foundation retain a really strong commitment to strengthening multilateral cooperation and collective action on key issues of peace and security, but it also retains a really important commitment to community and the fact that as citizens anywhere in the world, we all have agency and the ability to create peaceful change. So for that reason, we've stayed in Muscatine, Iowa, despite the fact that I just about 10 minutes ago said I'm from Wyoming. So I work from Wyoming, but the foundation's still located in Iowa, and I feel very lucky to work for such a great institution. So just really quickly on the question of what is to be done, I just had a couple of thoughts to share, just kind of framing thoughts. I don't want to get too far into detail, but I think there are a couple of really key questions for such a broad question. So when you think about what is to be done, you have to think about who is doing what. So who is, as we're all going to speak about, anyone from the individual all the way up to the international organizations and the highest political elite all across the globe. So each person that makes up these institutions and these structures in the world are making decisions every day about what we can do. The other question is, when are you doing it? So at the Stanley Foundation and in Kelsey and I's work, we focus primarily on prevention because every argument is really in the favor of prevention. It's much cheaper. It should be easier to do, although there are a lot of questions about how you actually prevent some of these things from happening, but we've chosen to tackle some of those questions. And so really looking at some of the drivers of what makes mass atrocities possible. So at the end of the day, it's humans who make those choices to commit mass atrocities, but there are conditions that you can try to address or do your best to address through policy related to law, related to discrimination, related to the social structures, related to economic opportunity, conditions like that can help societies become more resilient to the forces that make mass atrocities possible. But the reality is that they happen. Fortunately, they don't happen very often. But when they do, there are a lot of things that we can do. And I think it's important to remember that when you see these horrific things happen around the world, we actually do have a pretty complex toolbox of things that we can do. We always recommend that peaceful measures are pursued first, and that military or coercive force is used as a last resort. There are a lot of reasons for that to be the case, but gathering information, doing public advocacy, humanitarian assistance, monitoring, verification, and observation, unarmed civilian protection, political support, and diplomatic action. These are all things that are really, really crucial action points that people can take to try to counter some of the forces that are driving societies toward mass atrocities. So I won't go too much more into detail, but I did actually bring this. It's a policy analysis that we did. I think we completed it about 2 years ago. And it's called The First Response, Peaceful Means and the Third Pillar of the Responsibility to Protect. And it really does just kind of run through the range of peaceful choices people can make at not only the international level. A lot of this focuses on things that the United Nations can do or other regional organizations, but also things that humanitarians can do, that national actors can do, things like that. So if you're interested, you can always request free copies of any of the Stanley Foundation's publications. They're also all available online, so I just wanted to mention that that's out there as a resource if you're interested in any more detail on that. So I talked too much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief because quite a few of you had to endure me during the last evening. So again, I come from the George Washington University Department of Political Science and Jai-Ayla School of International Affairs, and we GW had a connection to the South Dakota World Affairs Council that goes back several years, precisely because there is an understanding, at least in the institution that I'm coming from, that if something is to be done, again, this is not going to come from Washington, D.C. That's going to come only from places like Brookings, South Dakota, and the rest of the country, because Washington, D.C. is dysfunctional, but also because people who are in Washington, D.C. really care about what people in Brookings, South Dakota have to say, more than they care about what people in Washington, D.C. have to say. So what is to be done? And, after watching this film, what is to be done to save people in Syria right now? And unfortunately, not much. We can go online, we can donate money, we can pressure and lobby our elected representatives. Whether it will make much difference, not immediately. Certainly not, if any at all. So when it comes to what is to be done, the Stanley Foundation does wonderful work from their perspective as a non-governmental organization. I think that, especially speaking in a setting like this university, what is to be done is also our duty as educators, as faculty members, as teachers, as college students. That will not help people in Aleppo or Syria as we speak, or tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. I don't think that, unfortunately, we have much to do to help those people besides donating money for white helmets. In the long run, though, I think that if there is something to be done, the only way to do it is through education. And education not of kids in a place like my home, like my institution, because the undergrad, they are all politics and policy junkies, but people, students in institutions that represent the rest of the country. And in the long run, that will probably have much more effect than anything else that can be done on this topic. So I'll stop here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Taneeza Islam. I'm an immigration lawyer here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And over this past year, we've started an organization called South Dakota Voices for Peace and South Dakota Voices for Justice. Our mission is to empower South Dakotans with accurate information to fight Islamophobia, anti-immigrant and refugee bigotry, so that we can build an inclusive South Dakota. So my piece to this conversation is going to be very local, and what we can do as South Dakotans, and how we can empower ourselves and become civically engaged, and also bring affected communities to the table. Since I graduated from law school in 2008, I've been mobilizing grassroots communities in Minnesota and very recently here in South Dakota. The important thing to remember is, as we saw from the video, when our Syrian refugee brothers and sisters are coming here, they have a lot of issues they need to deal with. A lot. So then to expect them to become civically engaged and talk to representatives and senators about their issues is challenging. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And so last year our organization came together because of really vitriolic resolutions and bills in our state capital, which is Pierre, South Dakota. This is the first time I got personally engaged in civic politics, local politics here in Pierre. So my reference is this past year. But as we started to dig a little bit, we've seen that our state legislator has actually proposed anti-immigrant, refugee, and Islamophobic bills and resolutions going back to about 2011. And in 2012, there was what we commonly call anti-Sharia legislation, which was passed here. That was before I got here, and I started talking to leaders and said, what happened? How did this pass in South Dakota? We're one of 15 states in our country that passed this bill, and one of the first to pass such bill. And there's been no response, at least no good response. Basically, it passed without muster, and that's because people weren't paying attention. Our everyday neighbors were not paying attention. Our communities directly affected were not paying attention. So a group of us got together this past year in 2017, when there was really, really vitriolic anti-refugee resolutions that were proposed. And many of you who are in this room were part of that effort. And being a voice. And what we were able to do is we were able to bring affected communities, so refugees, immigrants, and Muslim communities, to be a voice in Pierre, to drive 6 hours round trip, to train them on how to prepare their testimony. A lot of people were nervous because they had accents, right? And that didn't matter. And we heard from legislators that that was probably the first experience they've had where a group of 5 to 6 to 10 people came to be their own voice. And it was a really powerful moment. And a lot of our allies that were there were so excited to see us at the microphone giving our own testimony. So what you can do locally is become civically engaged, understanding that if these are issues that you're interested in, issues that affect immigrants, refugees, and Muslims, because unfortunately we all get mushed together. Okay, and that's how the political rhetoric is going and the propaganda is going right now. And that's why our mission encompasses those 3 specific subgroups. But be the eyes and ears for the immigrant and refugee and Muslim communities. Start building relationships with those leaders. Make sure that you diversify who you're building relationships with. Unfortunately, in my 10 years of experience of doing this work and being a first generation American Muslim born to immigrant parents from Bangladesh, what I oftentimes see is there's community leaders that pop up, and they usually are men. And they become the voice, and they don't share the information with the rest of the community. So it's important for us to understand those dynamics. And I will be the first to say that I do not believe that women cannot be a part of the process. So whenever I meet with a cultural organization, I always make sure that there's equal number of women, or I ask to make sure that women will be there, or I will not show up. And so be strong in that stance, because the women are the ones who have a pulse on what's going on in our schools, what kind of bullying is happening, what kind of accommodations that they need. So make sure that you force people to come to the table and empower a group of people then to go and empower their communities. So it's a very slow process. At the end of the day, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're the only organizations that are locally born and raised and that are trying to empower our local communities. Legislative session here in South Dakota starts January 8th, so it started a couple weeks ago. And the good news is we know it ends at the end of March. So we have 3 months that we really need to be the eyes and ears for everybody of what's happening top down in our state. And I will tell you that we are prepared this year. We've hired a full-time lobbyist to be our eyes and ears there, because at the end of the day, deals are happening in the hallway, and that's what I learned there last year. So even if we know, that there's a bill that's been introduced, there's lobbyists on the other side that are convincing legislators to vote one way. And if we're not there to be able to represent our voice, then the misinformation continues. And I will tell you that a lot of what I would say is discriminatory resolutions and bills that are being proposed is because of misinformation that our legislators have, or not realizing the unintended consequences for the policies and laws that they're setting. Case in point, just this Monday, SB 103 was introduced. SB 103 essentially says that undocumented people will not have access to higher education in our state. There's only 2 states in our country that ban undocumented access to higher education. That's Alabama and South Carolina. And if it passes in South Dakota, we'd be the 3rd. So luckily, our lobbyist in Pierre was able to have conversations where we know there's really good legislators, right? And kind of appealed to them and said, did you realize that this actually would affect Dreamers or DACA recipients in our community if the federal government can't do something about DACA? And she said, wow, I didn't think that through. But because we had the lobbyists there and were able to just give that one piece of information, we swing one vote. Right? And so that's the type of grassroots organizing and understanding the issues and being a voice. And at the very least, you can support local organizations. I'm assuming everyone's from South Dakota, so I'll do a plug for that for us. But support local organizations who are really doing the work. There's some national organizations that have offices here, but they don't do the work that the national organizations are doing. So be very mindful of what your local affiliates are really doing. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all very much. I think we've had a brief introduction so far into kind of international action that can happen. And so if you have any questions on that issue, please bring them to the floor, as well as locally and nationally, what's going on and what can be done for us as individuals and how we can be engaged. So I'd love to open up the floor to all of you if you have any questions, or for even the panelists, if you have questions for each other, things that sparked an interest in your own mind when you were listening.
I don't have a question, but a quick response to. Please go ahead. Where the responsibility to protect is? Sure. So the responsibility to protect is a principle that was adopted in the World Summit Outcome document in 2005. And it's a principle that says it has 3 pillars. So the first pillar is that the nation state is first and foremost responsible for protecting its citizens from atrocity crimes. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. The second pillar is that the international community, ranging from, again, the individual up to the nation state and international organizations, has a responsibility to come in and assist nation states in protecting their citizens. The third pillar is that when a nation state is manifestly failing to protect their citizens and or targeting them directly itself, that the international community has permission under this principle to intervene in one way or another. So the third pillar of the responsibility to protect has been what is most challenging about the principle, and it has caused the most concern because state sovereignty is perceived as what is within my borders is my territory, and I can do whatever I want to. But the responsibility to protect really tried to turn that and say, well, sovereignty is responsibility. But many individuals, many state leaders think that under the third pillar, it can be the responsibility to protect can be used to basically pursue political means by military force. So it's complex, it's complicated, but the R2P has been used quite a few times in UN resolutions to justify certain measures that take place, not always military intervention, but it has been used, for instance, in Libya. R2P was called on. That's one of the more controversial circumstances that people say it's been used for military force, but it's also been called on for peacekeeping initiatives and in diplomatic initiatives to try to overcome risky scenarios. But in general, most people who work directly with R2P feel that the principle is, it's to the point of being accepted as a norm, but that there's still a lot of kind of practical answers that need to be surfaced and investigated in order to understand what does implementing R2P actually look like. And I think, this document that we have here really was a response to the controversial aspect of Pillar 3 and really saying there's a whole host of things that are peaceful in nature that you can do to respond to episodes of mass atrocities, and anyone you talk to will suggest that you pursue those as much as possible before the idea of coercive force is even considered, because that carries a whole host of other challenges with it. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. As you heard last night, I'm with the Refugee Congress. That's an organization founded by UNHCR to empower refugees to be the voice themselves, to go and advocate on behalf of other refugees, stateless persons, unaccompanied minors, and other or internally displaced persons. So what we've been doing, we've had lots of interesting bills in so far for many, many years. Not to 2011, it was before that, like in the school system, when the Sudanese students or Sudanese people started to be settled in so forth, and some were enrolled in the school system. They looked taller, some had beard. So when students went home and told their parents that they are learning with the older men, the parents came and took their kids out of the school. So what happened? A group of South Dakota faith met. There's always a coalition of good-hearted people in all communities. I met with the school board members and tried to train them to understand what these guys are. They're not going to hurt them or hurt their children. But anyway, they had beards. That means they're over 20-something. So they had to be placed in the technical schools. So there are some bills that, as Refugee Congress, that we were able to squash. As Dr. Finkel said last night, UN does a lot of work, and we don't make noise or sounds. We don't let people know. We just do our work underground, but it gets done. So South Dakota, I'm the delegate for Refugee Congress. We have 50 delegates in all states, and their job is to go and meet with the elected members in their states, in DC, and also we participate in international systems like the Syrian refugees in Jordan. We get their report on how they're affected or how the women are sexually trafficked. These people are able to go there and lure these women that there's better life out, and they're gone. things like those, we get those kind of reports. So we're not just sitting down in South Dakota or Hawaii. We do our work. It's like a full-time job, but it's fulfilling. As a former refugee, it's my obligation to give back. I cannot sit idle and not speak up on their behalf. So thank you for your presentation.
And thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. A question that I found myself thinking about this morning during Colin's presentation. He mentioned the fact that the Hutus had publicly come out against the Tutsis and had classified them as cockroaches. And they were to be killed. They were to be exterminated. And typically, before we're going to do something to another group of people, we have to put them at someplace lower on the social scale. How does this relate to our American public school education and what we see in terms of bullying?
It's a bit of a difficult question.
Yeah.
I'm known for raising difficult questions.
Would you like to speak, Jai?
Did you have something?
No.
Okay. I'm not sure I have a sophisticated response for you, but you're absolutely right. I think when we find ways to dehumanize another person, it makes it much easier to justify bullying, violence, your own fear, I think. And these are really true conditions that I believe have to take place for humans to take part in these atrocities. And I think last night you touched on this, but we tend to think that perpetrators of violence or bullying or any degree of the kind of issues that we're talking about must be unlike ourselves. I mean, certainly they're crazy or certainly there's something wrong with them. When evidence shows actually most perpetrators are perfectly normal, and that most people are capable of acting out of fear in ways that we wouldn't be able to fathom as we sit in this room together. And so I think taking action to actively counter those tendencies or trends that you start to see in society, and beginning in our schools, beginning with our children, and talking about inclusivity and talking about the importance of diversity and hearing from people who believe or think differently than you. I think these are really, really core important issues just to reinforcing resilient societies and resilient humans so that we're not overcome by fear. And I think most of what happens is fear-based when we start looking particularly at what happened in Rwanda and in other situations where people are dehumanized like that. So, yes.
Okay, so I don't think I can say that much about bullying. I'm not a product of an American public education system, at least at the high school level. But to add on what was just said, I think the bullying might be the first step, but the real threshold is when we start using those derogatory terms not for individuals but for groups. And when it becomes a group categorization like cockroaches, vermin, lice, and other stuff, when this group characterization trickles down to the individual level, when individuals are being identified with those group labels, then at that point there is certainly a lot to worry about.
Could I add? I think another group, though, that's included in that is the group terrorists. And that propaganda that we're seeing here, top down from the White House to local level is, the propaganda that Muslims and refugees who are not vetted properly are somehow a security risk. And, you know, we've witnessed President Trump tweeting false tweets of videos showing people who appear to be Muslims doing terroristic activities, and those were deemed to be false. And we need to understand that there's a propaganda machine when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-immigrant and refugee sentiment in the United States only is what I'm talking about. The Center for American Progress wrote the first report in 2011 that identified this network of think tanks, of grassroots organizations, of echo chambers, of foundations fueling this fire, and it's called Fear Inc. 2.0. So I encourage you to read that to see how $57 million has been pumped into this industry to basically convince otherwise good, hardworking Americans that all Muslims will pose some sort of security threat. And that's exactly the rhetoric that we're seeing coming to local legislatures and then fueling the bills that we're seeing and the resolutions that we're seeing. And look, if your pastors are using this information, if your elected officials are using this information, if our president is using our information, those are conversations that are happening at the dinner tables. And the kids are hearing that, and they're taking that back to the schools, and bullying occurs. So it's definitely, for me, it's a top-down situation. And I think the victims end up being kids in schools or employees at workplaces or people who look differently walking down the streets. And we know from Pew Research that hate crimes motivated by religion, the number one group is still Jewish and anti-Semitic crimes, but the second is Muslims and those who appear to be Muslim. So it's important to understand how this propaganda is being fueled, who those actors are, and specifically in South Dakota, what impact that network has here, who's bringing in the speakers. Over 24 anti-refugee, immigrant, Islamophobic speakers from a national level and international level have been brought to South Dakota since January of 2017, and how we need to educate our neighbors on some of the myths and the facts, and that's something that we're doing at South Dakota Voices for Peace, building kind of that platform. But also, I would say, as individuals, if you hear misinformation at your dinner table, that you have to speak up. We're not in a time anymore that we can remain silent and say, oh, that's just my crazy uncle. We know how he is at Thanksgiving. Because our kids are listening to that and listening that there's maybe a pass for the crazy uncle. But I'm really encouraging people to be empowered to push back on that propaganda at our dinner tables, because that's where it's really going to start, at the individual level.
I just want to quickly respond to that a bit, that I think, I really appreciate the idea you brought up, Taneeza, of combating misinformation. And then I can also hear in some of the other comments we've had this morning so far about how building empathy is so critical, and creating space for conversations that enable that kind of empathy can be so powerful. And I have been convinced time and again on the impact of just standing with an individual and being with them. And that can come in a bullying situation for your children in school, or that can be even if you see someone being discriminated against on the street. So I think I've been really impressed by our feedback so far, but please.
So the rise in Islamophobia and anti-immigration, do you believe that there is a tie between that and the retraction of U.S. history, of what we'd done to indigenous populations, and kind of trying to kind of put the shroud of we're kind of innocent and everyone else is like, we're talking about Rwanda and Syria. And can you expand more on that?
Can I just clarify your question for the panel?
Yeah.
So are you asking about the relationship between Islamophobia and then how we perceive our own history and indigenous relations?
Yeah, is there a correlation?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I might start. So, look, the truth is that no society is immune from large-scale violence. And actually, if you look at history, almost every society in the world is built on large-scale violence. So the US is not unique, and every society has people who hate others and express their grievances that are often quite legitimate in the form of hatred of others. So we can look at the history of places like South Dakota or any other place in the US and find the traces. But the US wouldn't be unique. Every society has it. So there is nothing unique about the current wave of anti-immigration sentiment and the US treatment of the natives. We have had waves of strong anti-immigration violence throughout all US history. We're not in a unique moment. It just, right now, it exploded to the levels that we actually pay attention to. But the legacy existed always, and the people who express those views existed always. It's nothing unique to us. We just now start paying attention because we have politicians expressing those views that were not expressed 10 years ago, but they were expressed 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 100 years ago. You just need to look at US history and you will find them always there. So it's nothing new.
I have a question for the lawyer about Islamophobia. That's a touchy topic, but I'll try to just ask my question. Can you make it clear for the public today whether it's true that we have radical Muslims who are actually committing atrocities? And so at some point, someone would say, yes, the US is right to put some quotas, to put some limitations in admitting people in the US, or that's a lie.
I don't work in black and white. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a black or white answer. I think there is radical people who claim to be Muslim who have taken over the religion to propagate their political agenda, as we've found in all faiths. There are Christian terrorists, there are Buddhist terrorists. For me personally, from a personal level, any person who uses religion to propagate violence, I don't believe is a true believer in that religion. There's no religion of violence. All of our religious texts have violent passages. All of our religions have political, religious violence history. However, the overwhelming majority of all followers of any religion prescribe to the compassion and the peace and the love that they find in their religion. So, right now, it appears that by painting all Muslims as terrorists, it becomes easy to dehumanize who we are as people, and then that allows elected officials the platform that they need to say we need to vet more or to have more stringent policies. Statistically, if you believe in the power of numbers and research and statistics, statistically, the biggest threat, terroristic threat on US soil is white nationalist terrorism. It's a fact. So then to say that because of terrorism that we're seeing worldwide and focusing then on Muslim, I'm using air quotes, Muslim terrorists, that we should close down the refugee resettlement program, which was really what Muslim ban 1, 2, 3, and whatever version we're in now. That's really that was the foundational argument for those policies. Okay, so if you look at the statistics and then you look at the policies and they're incongruent, we need to start asking questions on why are we making those connections? So I'm sorry, I don't think it's a yes or no question.
My question is about media and how you think it could be used as both a solution and how it is already a problem. We talked about propaganda, but then we heard from Colin about how it was the radio that was spreading, saying this is who you should kill and that kind of stuff. So just how do you think the media and or Hollywood should be part of this?
So at the Stanley Foundation, we actually have her name is Devin, and she's our media program officer. We have a Devin. She's great. And her job actually is taking the work that we do on the policy team and engaging with members of the media to try to educate, but also just interact with and engage on some of these complex issues so that when reporters and journalists are out and trying to portray a situation in a certain way, that they're informed by expertise, essentially. And so I think, there were a lot of questions last night actually about technology and the role that it plays in violence and in the lead up to violence and in the aftermath of violence. And I think I agree, and if you want to add to this, you can, but I think it's a neutral tool, and that it's used however the individual using it is choosing to use it. So we can see it in very positive ways. I mean, information is so important. Education is so important, and the media plays a role in that. It's on us to look at our sources, to find good resources, to know who to trust, to know who's doing their due diligence. But it can also be used for terrible things, and that's just the reality. And so I think what we should do is not give too much power to the tool, and to realize that how we use those tools is really what matters more.
So if I just might add the sentence or two. So you're right, we had a lot of questions about the media yesterday, and after the lecture I came to realize that our focus on the media and us being so hung up on what technology can do, it's more than anything else a sign of probably a desperation of sort. We are looking for quick fixes. We are looking for magical solutions. And maybe this will be the magical solution. Maybe cell phones will be this quick fix or this magic wand that will solve everything. No, they would not. Unfortunately not. I know we're desperately looking for something, but technology will not save us. Technology is just a tool. So unless we learn how to use this tool for better or for worse, technology will be capable of doing good things and doing great things, but it's essentially up to us what we do with technology. Technology will not save us. Only us can save us.
I think the fascinating thing about media, as we're building a new nonprofit organization and considering how to message from our end to the community, one thing that's been really challenging is that because of our instant gratification with media and our ability to access a gazillion sources, in Facebook and the Twitter feeds and 180 characters, that our attention spans have gotten so short, right? That we're not willing to read through an article if we have to scroll through 2 screens, right? I find myself doing that. Like, oh, this seems like a really interesting article. Oh my gosh, it's 3 pages. I can't read the whole thing right now. So how do we message? I mean, technology might not be saving us, but the issue for me is that's how we're getting information. So how do we work in that world with being able to educate our communities in depth about issues when our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter? And how are we going to do that?
We have a few minutes left for questions, so any last burning questions you may have, we have some time. I think I saw your hand first. Sorry, over here.
Dr. Finkel and others in the panel, I'd like to ask you to respond to Dr. Finkel's comment, only us can save us. And let's get to the nitty-gritty, talk about that, but all of the basic theory of this thing. Dr. Finkel, how can us save us?
The question was, just so everyone could hear, how can us or we save us?
Again, I think it first and foremost depends on who you are. And if you are a teacher or a faculty member in this institution, then you can do it through teaching, or you can do it through law or through NGO work. It's what you do. And no matter what you do, we saw those blacksmiths and formal builders becoming rescuers. So I think that just by doing our job and doing it properly and paying attention to what's going on in the world and being engaged, if we all do it, that would be enough.
I think that's a really good point. There's so much to be done that we don't have to necessarily struggle to make choices. I think getting informed is really important, and education is really important, and not just for our children, but for our communities. And at the Stanley Foundation, we do a lot of education for policymakers, and most of our conversations are with academics, with policymakers in the US, at the UN, in foreign countries, and everybody needs to be educated all of the time, and then take action. So get the information and then do something with it. So stand next to somebody who is from a foreign country and might be being discriminated against. Lobby your legislators to make sure that there are ordinances at the community level that get rid of discrimination. Work or donate to international NGOs who are on the front lines providing medical services and education and shelter to people who are fleeing episodes of mass violence. There is so much that we can each do as individuals, and I completely agree that if you engage and if we all engage, the world will be a better place.
My concern is rural America, because there are not enough people of color, there are not enough immigrants or refugees to have dinner at everyone's dinner table. So then that becomes a responsibility of each one of you in this room, each one of our neighbors, to take that on and to spread factual information. And so that becomes the challenge. Again, to write people off as, oh, they're in rural America, they have 200 people there, they don't really matter. I think if anything, my biggest takeaway from this past presidential election cycle is rural America is really what matters. And we need to figure out new strategies to engage rural America in these conversations and identify how, it would be great if I could go have dinner table at every house in South Dakota, because when they see me and I say, are you scared of a Muslim? And I say, I'm a Muslim. They say, no, I'm not scared of you. Because that's really what it takes, right? I call it putting a face to the name. But how are we going to do that in such a big state that's sparsely populated with 0.003% of the population being Muslim, or maybe 0.05% being immigrant or refugee? So we need to all come together in this state to figure out how to bring that conversation to the everyday dinner tables.
We can take your question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm kind of nervous right now. I had a specific question pertaining to, can I move this up? Pertaining to the 115, you said 15 states in 2011 passed this Sharia law. Was that kind of accordance with maybe like party lines? Are legislators transparent in understanding what the constituents want? You had mentioned that they didn't know that they had these constituents that actually were from the specific background. So I'm thinking to myself, have you had experiences where the legislators weren't necessarily just educated, understood the policies, or just doing this quid pro quo thing that seems to often happen? Just asking from experience. That's kind of a broad question, I realize.
Sure.
Just wanted to
No, thank you for your question. I think what I've realized is that legislators fall on a spectrum. There's some legislators who are bigoted and that's their purpose in bringing up these bills and resolutions. There's some legislators that don't understand the issue and just will sign on. There's some legislators that don't understand the unintended consequences of the policies and laws that they're setting. So that's why our model is really a continuum of action. So we are working top down in having conversations at a policy level by hiring our full-time lobbyists this past year, to bottom up, where we have to have our communities engage with legislators to say, hey, we're constituents and we don't want this. There's a big disconnect, right? I mean, I don't know what voter apathy percentages are. I'm sure you guys have those statistics, but it's even less and less at a local level, right? And so to have local people act with state senators and state representatives and be a voice, that really is what sways their opinion. We have districts in our state where bigoted people have run for office uncontested. So they literally get in automatically because there's no one contesting them, and people just kind of down ballot, vote for folks, and they're making these decisions that affect our daily lives on a local level. So I have become very empowered with being a part of this local legislative process for the last year to really get people to understand is local politics is really what matters when we're talking about everyday types of policies that affect us on an everyday basis.
If you have a short question, I think we have time to take it.
Not a question, but just kind of information point. I'm a member of the Brookings City Human Rights Commission, and the commission, along with the South Dakota World Affairs Council, went to the city council in this year ago in February, and the council adopted this resolution of inclusivity, making the city an opening, welcome, inclusive city that was adopted unanimously. And the council is continuing to go ahead and work on issues of inclusivity. We have a couple of different issues, projects in mind. We're right now in the process of working with the school system or trying to maybe bring in a teaching tolerance curriculum to be implemented in the school system. And there's other issues we're working on too. So if people have some interest in working on this issue, just kind of see me and we can work to get together on this. Thank you.
Thank you. So to close, I made just a little list right here of some of the things that I heard from our panelists, but also our wonderful audience members. And thank you for your great engagement. And I'm just going to quickly read it. And this is sort of to answer that question of what's to be done. So at the international level, I think I heard Jai mention, and Evgeny as well, that we have peaceful choices to make that our legislators can make. That there's multilateral responses that are informed and supported by the responsibility to protect framework, especially Pillar 3, as Jai described, and that they can be influenced by everyday individuals, including at the national level, talking about national policymakers too. We can combat negative group labels or the dehumanization of groups. We can educate everybody more and more. And bring greater awareness. We can pay attention to keep our eyes open to what's going on. And when we see negative or bigoted or racist conversations, be engaged with your neighbors. Be a good neighbor. Be engaged especially with immigrant communities that might be shy to open up. And so sometimes all people need is that firsthand. Conversations can build empathetic understanding. And that is so huge. And we can do so much to empower one another and empower those within our communities at a community level, but also in national or local government and national government. So I have to thank all of you so much for allowing us to be here, and I have to thank all of our panelists, Taneeza, Evgeny, Jai. Thank you all so much.